The hunt for treasure. It's sort of as old as recorded civilization, and it has motivated many an expedition and many a lone soul striking out into the wilderness. We're going to look at all of that today. We're going to talk about, is it the hunt or is it the treasure? We're going to look at the Forrest Fenn saga, the kind of first maybe mass media treasure hunt. And then we'll also talk about people who are hunting for a treasure which is no treasure at all. These are the geocachers. Or maybe they find their treasure where their hearts are. Well, hello. Welcome to another show. This one is produced by celebrity producer Lily Tyson. This is a show that I wouldn't have thought of doing, but I'm so glad that we're doing it. It's about treasure hunting. And I think it's about treasure hunting on 2 or 3 different levels. Just sort of the practical fact that there are treasures and people hunt for them. There's also the sense of the quest. You know, in some ways, as we will talk about in the third segment when we discuss geocaching, it doesn't have to be much of a treasure. People like just getting out there and looking for stuff. And I think also there is that notion that you could, and I think this has inflamed and informed the act of treasure hunting for most of human history. It's one of your opportunities to change your station in life, right? I mean, if you in fact are, of humble origins, if you could find that treasure, you could change things pretty drastically. I mean, you would probably be better off putting like $20 into a, index stock fund from the time you're 25 or something. You'd probably be much better off at the end than you would be looking for treasure. But, it's like the lottery. Somebody's going to hit it. Somebody's going to find that treasure. As we go along today, we will talk a little bit later about sort of the 21st century's so far, by far, greatest and most mass market, mass media viral treasure hunt. And that would be the Forrest Fenn treasure. But we want to talk about the act of treasure hunting, too, and sort of all the mythology that goes behind it and all the impulses that inform it. And as I say, it'll be geocaching at the end. And in fact, the creator of the blog Geocaching While Black, because as we now have been reminded rather painfully in this country over the last 2 or 3 years, it's one thing to be white and wandering around looking for something that nobody else can see in God knows what part of what town in the middle of nowhere. It's another thing, quite another thing to try to do that when one is a person of color. So anyway, we'll talk about all that stuff. But our guide here in the first 2 segments will be Dan Barbarisi, author of Chasing the Thrill, Obsession, Death, and Glory in America's Most Extraordinary Treasure Hunt. That extraordinary treasure hunt will be the Forrest Fenn one. We'll talk about that a little bit in the second segment. But first of all, Dan Barbarisi, let's just sort of talk about treasure hunting in general. First of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Colin. Appreciate it. Happy to be here.
Can you I actually know from reading your book, one of the things that might have informed and inflamed your own mind and heart about treasure hunting. It was a movie that you saw when you were young. Kat, let's hear a little of that.
You guys, this map is old news. Everybody and their grandfather went looking for that when our parents were our age. I mean, haven't you ever heard of that guy? What's his name? The pirate guy. One-Eyed Willie.
One-Eyed Willie. Yeah, he was the most famous pirate in his time. My dad told me all about him once.
Dad'll do anything to get you to go to sleep.
No. See, One-Eyed Willie stole treasure once. It was full of rubies and emeralds and diamonds. Diamonds. And then he loaded it all up onto a ship. And they sailed away into the sunset until the British king, he found out about it, and then he set up this whole armada to go out after him. And then the armada, it took him a couple weeks, but then they caught up with Willie, and then there was a whole big war between the armada and Willie's ship, the Inferno. And during the firefight, there was just guns bursting here and cannons bursting there. And then Willie fled because he didn't want to stay around because he knew he'd get killed if he stayed around. And then he got into this cave. And then the British, they blew up the walls all around him. And he got caved in. And he's been there ever since. Forever. And ever trapped. Wow.
So for people who don't recognize that, that's, of course, from Citizen Kane. No, it's not. Dan, maybe you better tell them.
Yeah, that is certainly too familiar to people of a certain age. That's the Goonies. Richard Donner just passed away. His very fun treasure hunting film from, I think it was 1986, and that's Sean Astin, later more famous as Samwise Gamgee in Lord of the Rings, doing most of the talking there. And for me, being 6-7 years old at the time, that was totally intoxicating. That was the idea. You little kid can go in with your buddies and actually go find a buried treasure, a hidden treasure, and, be part of a big adventure. And, obviously then reality intervenes and you don't get to do that because life doesn't, generally speaking, go that way until every once in a while you find out it actually does. And so, that's kind of where I picked up the Forest Fen hunt in 2017 when a friend of mine told me about it and that there was this real life treasure hunt and it actually existed. And you too could go and search for the treasure. And, that brought me back to being that little kid who, wanted to go and bring his Goonie buddies around and go find One-Eyed Willie's loot. So as soon as I found out that was a real thing, I decided to kind of dive into that whole hog and try to be a part of that treasure hunt. And also because I was, a journalist and author as well, chronicle that treasure hunt and try to tell the story of it in grand form. So, that's kind of how I got into the Forest Fen story.
It's all the Goonies' fault. So, so we'll talk we'll talk a lot about that in our second segment. But this being a public radio show, we have to talk about the histories of things and stuff like that. So, and it is true that there's this kind of repeat of that cycle. There aren't always movies because it's too early in history. But for example, one of the people that you write about, and this guy, what an amazing story. I kind of went down a rabbit hole with him. Captain William Phipps, who in the 17th century, late 17th century, inflames the mind of the British public. Although I would point out, he's actually from Maine. He's actually a very early Mainer who makes his way back to England and becomes part of a huge story about a treasure. I'll let you pick up the tale.
Yeah, one of the things that I was able to do in Chasing the Thrill was kind of look at where it stood in the, the continuum of treasure hunting for all time and look at past treasure hunts and how these things evolved. And as you mentioned, the story of Captain Phipps is a really interesting one, a guy who would go on actually to become governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and then actually preside over the Salem witch trials. Really interesting dude, but he also was a very early treasure hunter. So, there's been treasure hunting forever. There Egyptians were seeking treasure back from older tombs back then. And then, the Romans would go seek stuff from treasure civilizations before them. And, there's myth, there's legend, there's the idea that there actually is stuff in the ground from civilizations before ours. All that kind of works together. But, in so many ways, treasure hunting really kicked off, with the galleons and the Spanish Main and the idea that, there was all this quote unquote new world treasure being brought back from the New World to the Old World in the 1600s. And a lot of those ships were not going to make it across, whether it was because of battle or much more often storms. A lot of these Spanish galleons, replete with silver and gold and many other valuables, were sunk in the Atlantic. And so, within about 100 to 200 years, technology started to advance to the point where hunters could actually go and seek some of these treasures. They mentioned the diving bell was very important, some other things. And Captain Phipps was one of the early ones to kind of figure that out and really act on that. And, his story is one of real treasure seeking and real treasure hunting. It has, so many of the tropes that we almost associate with treasure hunting today, and a secret map to the treasure and competition and pirates and all this kind of stuff is part of his journey. And then eventually, he actually does come up with serious Spanish treasure, brings it back to England, is a completely rich man from that point on, and really kicks off a treasure hunting craze, which in the late 1600s, and that becomes something where all of a sudden that becomes part of the modern. It really inflames, as you said, modern excitement at that time, and everyone wants to go become a treasure hunter and go find their own, galleon to bring up. And obviously, it doesn't go like that for most people, but it really started to, I think, kick off the modern era of treasure hunting at that time. And people saw it was possible, and technology had advanced, and the finds were really out there to go and make themselves rich.
Right. And, in a way, well, we should talk a little bit about it, though. And another thing that comes along with that eventually is literature that accompanies this idea or that further inflames this idea. The classic, obviously, is Robert Louis Stevenson. We have with Treasure Island. I happen to feel that the definitive movie version of Treasure Island is the Muppet one. So you're about to hear.
I love that one, yes.
You'll hear Jim Hawkins and Billy Bones. You'll also hear the great Gonzo and Rizzo the Rat, who do not appear in the original Robert Louis Stevenson novel, but I think are intrinsic to this particular scene.
It's mine! I'm going for that treasure myself! And no one-legged son of a bilge rat will...
Captain Bones! He died? And this is supposed to be a kid's movie.
Jimmy! You always been a decent sort to old Billy Bones.
But I'm not Jimmy Jim. He's Jimmy Jim.
Jim?
Yes, Captain.
Jim.
Yes, Captain, what is it?
Take the map.
What map?
The map to old Flint's treasure. Don't you understand what I've been telling you? I was Flinty's first mate. We all were. Blind, you and me. Oh, my old shipmates. They'll gully me for sure. And anybody else to get their mitts on that map.
And gullying hurts, right?
Oh, aye. A lot. So quick, go to my sea chest. Get the map.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there.
I'd like to point out that one of the things they find in the sea chest is a copy of Diplomacy by Henry Kissinger, as they're just tossing things over their shoulders, looking for it. But, in some seriousness anyway, that becomes another part of it, right? Then there becomes a kind of adventure, a narrative pattern that people become familiar with, Dan, that idea.
Yeah, very much. I mean, Stevenson is really the guy who I think he collated a lot of those tropes and really just centralized them in one place. The idea of X on the map, the peg leg pirate with the parrot, the skeleton points the way to the treasure. All that stuff is in Treasure Island, and those tropes are really kind of unified there, and that leads to a lot of other treasure hunting adventures in that late 1800s period too. That's another boom time for treasure hunting, and some of the real treasure hunts that actually exist today to some extent date to that period. When people would start to tell stories that probably had some truth to them but have a lot of myth to them. And I think that Treasure Island, King Solomon's Mines, which also came out around the same time, have a lot to do with that, where art boosts truth and truth boosts art, and they kind of work in tandem to create these legends that people then actually go out and follow. Things like, I don't know if you're going to get into this, but things like the Beale Papers, which are a great treasure hunt out of Virginia, and the Lost Dutchman mine, one out of the Southwest, have their origins around this period. And I think Treasure Island and the rise of that fiction and the codification of those tropes has a lot to do with that.
Right. And it seems like, some of the patterns are in terms of, why treasure might exist. Sometimes it's a lost civilization, either a city or a group of people who vanished, but supposedly their treasure is left behind somewhere in the mountains between Arizona and New Mexico or something. And then people who are up to no good in one way or another. I mean, you're from Massachusetts. I'm from Connecticut. Captain Kidd is big around here. There's an idea that Captain Kidd's treasure still might be out in some wonky little island somewhere, maybe even a little ways up the Connecticut River. People are always looking for Captain Kidd stuff. So he's a pirate, or whatever you want to call him. But you also there's an entire TV show where people are looking for Nazi treasure, all the stuff that the Nazis basically looted from people that they oppressed. And some of it's been found, some of it hasn't, some of it's supposed to be in the bottom of a lake. So there's sort of, evildoers probably are the people who sometimes kind of lose control of their treasure.
Yeah, I think in a lot of these, you have to have like a plausible reason and then a reason to go and seek it. It's like, all right, well, why is this thing out there? Why was it lost? Okay, again, the Spanish galleon example is the classic one. That one makes sense. Okay, a storm came into the bottom of the ocean. I get that. Otherwise, it's like, well, my great uncle Fred, he buried this treasure in this swamp because, and that usually doesn't hold water. So, a lot of the times, when the more professional treasure hunters are seeking these things, they explore these stories and they look at them and they say, all right, well, what actually makes sense here? What's real? What has some truth to it, even if there's a lot of legend steeped in with it? And they look for these things and, they parse out these stories and see what the origin of it is and what the nut at the core of that is. And a lot of times it does have to do with war or turmoil or evil doing in some way, because that a lot of times is when fortunes change hands. In calm times, nobody's hiding treasure in the mountains, other than the example I know we're going to get to later. But, that doesn't usually lead to the kind of treasure you're finding. Usually it is chaos that breeds this kind of thing, because otherwise people just put their money in banks. They don't just bury it somewhere. It doesn't happen that way, and the stories don't hold up for those reasons. So I think, you do run into a lot of those where something has to go wrong, and that does make it more compelling. A lot of the reason why people want to seek this stuff is because it's connected to a compelling story. I said in the book at one point that, there are easier ways to get rich than looking for treasure, including buying a lottery ticket. You are almost very much definitely not going to get rich looking for treasure. But it's about the chase. It's about being a part of that story and attaching yourself to the history there and being a part of something that is bigger than yourself. And that is a very attractive idea to people.
So, as we move in closer towards modernity and the world becomes a little bit more tamed, and as you go across America, towns tend to look more and more like one another. They all have CVS's and Boston markets or whatever, and so, you would think maybe this whole thing would go away or it would be even more sought after. But it does seem, and this will sort of form the bridge from where we are now to the second segment. We'll talk about Forrest Fenn, that the kind of planned insertion of treasure, and the planned and heavily publicized insertion of treasure into an environment becomes a big deal. And so one of these happens, as you document in your book, in England. It involves, actually, I was so weird reading this book, Dave, because I interviewed Bamber Gascoigne right around this time
That's very interesting.
about something completely different. But explain the just really quickly the kind of the whole masquerade story.
Yeah, so one of the sad tragedies of the modern world is they're not really making more treasure. Nobody's sinking Spanish galleons for us. Nobody is losing these gold chests on wagon trains. It's just not happening. So at the same time, the desire to be part of these grand adventures still exists. And so there came the development of what are kind of known as armchair treasure hunts, which are usually essentially, man-made treasure hunts that somebody puts out there and you are supposed to find the treasure. The whole idea is that this thing has been crafted for the audience to actually go and seek this thing. And the first really great one of those was called Masquerade, which took place from essentially 1979 to 1982 in England. And an artist named Kit Williams came up with a treasure hunting book, essentially where he drew pictures, and inside the pictures, the pictures themselves were a form of code. And if you could decipher what the underlying theme was, you could figure out what each of the pictures meant. And if you put them all together, which was not easy to do, you could then lead yourself to the location of a treasure. And as you mentioned, Bamber Gascoigne, who was a television host at the time, was involved in publicizing and verifying this to this extent. So, it became a huge phenomenon in England in that time, and to some extent worldwide, although, it was harder for things to do that back then. It was hard to get a copy of the book outside England. So, but millions of copies were sold, and people were searching for this thing and digging up areas all over England at the time. And, eventually a couple of years later, it was found. The thing, there was a whole very complicated thing where, at noon on a certain day at a church, a shadow cast over a spot led you to dig in that location. It's a whole thing. It was actually really very intelligent, very brilliant. Although, as with the case with so many of these hunts, it kind of ended in a little bit of scandal when a number of years later, it turned out that the person who actually found the treasure had a connection to the ex-girlfriend of the guy who had hidden it. And she had helped her new beau to locate the right spot. Not that the author had anything to do with it. He was, completely blameless in this, but there was an element of corruption to this. And that, is something that unfortunately you do find in a lot of these treasure hunts, the armchair ones, the man-made ones, where there's, some tinge of scandal to it. And that, I think is in many people's minds today. But Masquerade was a great one and led to a number of others like The Secret that came after it. And just, it really kicked off to some extent the armchair hunting craze, which is, a much more modern form of treasure hunting than the traditional go and find something that nobody intended you to find that was lost by accident hundreds of years ago.
Right. Dan Barbarisi, it's a messy, messy, dirty, dirty world we live in sometimes. And we will be talking a little bit about that because, in fact, the Forrest Fenn story is not entirely clean of attendant scandals. That's what we're going to talk about with Dan in the second segment. He's the author of Chasing the Thrill, Obsession, Death, and Glory in America's Most Extraordinary Treasure Hunt. We'll take a break. We'll return. All right. We're talking about treasure hunting. We're doing that with Dan Barbarisi, who's the author of Chasing the Thrill, Obsession, Death, and Glory in America's Most Extraordinary Treasure Hunt. That would be the Forrest Fenn treasure hunt. And for those of you who didn't pick up on it, although what did really eventually become very much a mass media plus an internet viral story, we'll just try to lay out the bare bones of it for you before we talk a little bit more about what happened. So Dan Barbarisi, first of all, we should say that this man, Forrest Fenn, was interested in doing a lot of different things in creating this sort of artificial treasure hunt. But one of them was self-mythologizing, right? There was, first of all, you should quickly just even he thought he was going to do something like this many years before he did it, because he thought he was going to die pretty young from a form of cancer.
Yeah, I'll give you the kind of Cliff's Notes version of the whole thing.
Yeah.
So Forrest Fenn was a fighter pilot from the Korea-Vietnam era who became a very well-known art dealer out of Santa Fe in the 70s and 80s. Had a big famous gallery. Was really part of the scene there. Had a lot of very famous friends. Was kind of an art dealer to the stars for Southwestern art. And in the late 80s, he was diagnosed with cancer on his inferior vena cava. And he was given a 1 in 5 chance to live, and he was not expected to survive. And Fenn was the kind of guy who did not like being told those kind of odds. And he was, very unhappy about this diagnosis, obviously. And he didn't want to take it sitting down or lying down, as the case may be. And, he had this grand collection, and his friend Ralph Lauren, this is how the tale goes, was in his study with him, which is a magnificent room with all his, attendant treasures there. And, he wanted to buy a headdress off him. And Fenn said, I'm not going to buy it. I'm not going to sell it to you. And then Lauren said, Fenn, you can't take it with you, assuming that as he knew he was probably going to die. And Fenn said, well, why can't I? And, they kind of had a laugh about it. But that was what led him to come up with a very, unusual plan, that he was going to take some of his wealth and some of the fantastic objects he had collected over the years, put them in an actual treasure chest, take that chest somewhere out into the wilderness to a special spot, put the chest down, and then take a number of pills and literally die next to it. And he would have written a poem that would be essentially published posthumously that would then lead searchers to the location of his body and his chest, and they could leave his bones, take his chest, and go in peace. Now, fortunately, I think for everyone involved, Fenn actually miraculously beat the cancer in the late 80s. And so he did not have the reason to go through with his plan. But he liked it. He didn't just, it wasn't just some crazy near-death thing for him. And so over the next 20 plus years, he kind of kept at it and kept refining the plan and started to actually acquire the treasure chest and fill the chest with valuables. And he started working on the poem and really crafted it into something so that, when by the time 2010 hit, he had his plan ready to go. And he decided he was 80-ish, let's say at the time. And he published the book, his memoir, The Thrill of the Chase, which contained a poem. And this is the one he had been refining for so long. And if one followed that poem, it led to a spot where he had hidden this treasure chest. And from that point, he kind of just put it out into the world and said, essentially, have at it. And it started as kind of a very small, kind of local curiosity in the Southwest. Probably a few thousand people looking for this thing. Local art dealer hides treasure. People go searching for it. News 11 kind of thing. But it actually began to gain a much larger audience through publication of a few different magazine articles, one in the United Flight magazine, Hemispheres, one in Newsweek, and then pivotally, it appeared on the Today Show in 2013, and the whole thing just went crazy. It became a true worldwide phenomenon at that point. Tens and tens of thousands of people started looking for this thing, and it completely morphed into this craze. And so for the next 3 or 4 years from there, it just was this big phenomenon where people were just out there looking for it. They would go what's called boots on the ground in the search area, which was New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana, in search of Fenn's treasure. And a whole culture developed around it. You have these events called Fennbarese, where devotees would actually go out there and meet each other. You would have, kind of to some extent groups who would, work together. You'd have friendships develop, romances develop, rivalries develop. And this whole world and ecosystem that begins to live around this treasure hunt. And, it became this fascinating phenomenon. That's essentially when I came into it around 2017.
So, yeah, it becomes this gigantic thing, and five people died.
At least 5 people. The first one was in 2016, and then 3 of them in 2017, like right after I kind of entered the fray, and then another one in 2020.
So I have this sort of NPR wussy talk theory that I'm going to float by you, and it was somewhat inspired by the sort of the Don Quixote of your book, to whom you are kind of a Sancho Panza. I think he's called Beep in the book, and you mention that his money for financing his quest comes from cryptocurrency. And I find myself thinking, well, really, first of all, the whole history of currency is a gradual detachment from the actual things of value that it represented. So, I mean, once it wasn't gold backed or whatever, and cryptocurrency is kind of the ultimate culmination of this, where, most of the value and what's come after cryptocurrency too, FTPs and stuff like that, just things that are just theoretical forms of value. And I'm wondering if some of the fever that accompanied the Forrest Fenn thing was this sort of, because it's right around the time and that cryptocurrency is really starting to become part of the consciousness, this fever for something that's actually of tangible value, the stuff that's, that's in the chest. I mean, some of its value is the history that goes with it or the artistry that accompanies it, but a lot of it is just like gold stuff, and I'm wondering if maybe there's some atavistic part of us that still wants things like that, even as money becomes, less and less like money.
I think there certainly could be something to that. Like the tangible is always attractive versus kind of the ephemeral. But I think it's more, towards some of the stuff you were mentioning earlier about the idea of, wanting to believe in something and be part of something. And, one of the things that Fenn said in terms of why he put this thing out there was that, it was coming out of the financial crisis and, the housing crisis and people were not believing in anything. And he wanted to give them something kind of to dream on, and I think he had a number of reasons for actually hiding the chest, but I do think that is one of them. And I think that was one of the things that did appeal to people in that time period, that, this gave them something to aspire to. And the idea that there was something bigger out there than themselves and this thing that you could chase and capture. And even if you don't find it and get rich off it, because that's not really the point, you're going to have, a sense of purpose and a sense of something to quest for. And I think that, that feeling of hope and seeking is really valuable to people. But yeah, I think that, the idea of a tangible thing to seek is certainly something as well. But yeah, so what you were referring to there is that, the guy, so when I went into this kind of journalist/seeker, I tagged on to a guy named Jay Rayner, who went by the name Beep I'm a Jeep, known as Beep more often, who, yes, was a fantasy sports superstar who then became a crypto millionaire, because he was, as many of those guys were early into crypto. And so that was some of what he used to bankroll some of his adventures out there, which I tagged along with him on in the 2017-ish period when, Ether and all those other currencies were really just starting to hit the popular landscape. And, I got some nice dinners out there off him and his bankrolling on that. Although, I was not smart enough to fully buy into crypto at that phase. I think I had Bitcoin at 3 and sold it at 6 and thought I was very smart. I was not very smart, it turned out. But I think there's certainly a lot to the idea that, treasure is something you can hold in your hand. And it is something that, again, some of the stuff you were doing out there, what is something worth? It's what we value it as. You mentioned NFTs. What is something worth to a person? Why is something that's buried in the ground for 2,000 years, even though it's essentially a piece of junk, have such incredible priceless value? What does it mean to us? We define what value is. We decided that gold was valuable because it was shiny and had some permanence to it. And it could be molded into things. We could have decided that quartz was really valuable. We didn't. But, we give something its value. And that's certainly the case, with the treasure chest and the treasure hunt and the reason that it mattered to people.
Now, another thing about Forrest Fenn was that he loved the American wilderness, the American outdoors, had loved it since he was a boy. And he wanted people to do something that the National Park Service wants you to do, which is get out and enjoy the splendors of America. But he also wanted people to do something that the National Park Service doesn't want you to do, which is leave the trail. I mean, at least it's pretty clear from the poem right away that you're going to have to go off the trail, which is kind of the thing that every sign in every state park and every national park tells you not to do. And there were some pretty negative consequences from all that.
Yeah, I think Fenn was a guy who, he took a certain pleasure in cultivating a maverick image. I don't think he was, seeking criminal activity all the time, but he certainly didn't mind bending the rules if he thought it served the correct purpose. And, in his mind, the world is out there for exploring. You're not supposed to just stay on the path. You're not just supposed to say what they tell you. You're supposed to go out there and find things and do stuff and have adventures and all that. And so, he didn't mind the idea that people were certainly going to go off the trail and seek his treasure. And there were going to be consequences to that. But I think, he certainly he didn't expect people to perhaps go to the lengths that they did and put themselves in the level of danger that they did in the search for his treasure. I think that, this thing becomes very complicated when people start trying to cross major rivers and climb to high peaks in search of his treasure. And he has to tell people, don't go somewhere where an 80-year-old man couldn't go to hide this thing. But the reality of this is that, once the treasure fever kind of takes hold, not everyone's going to listen to that. One of the things we ran into at our searching was that you can find pretty much any way you want to justify something to yourself. If you think that you're in pursuit of something, then that doesn't apply because of this, and this, we can go there because of that. And it's okay. He wanted us to do this, or he would have gone at a different time and it would have been accessible for an 80-year-old man. He was a very fit 80-year-old man. Whatever your rationalization is, people come up with them. And so they, started to put themselves in increasing dangerous situations. And, as you mentioned, that's what led to, all those deaths, and would have almost definitely led to more if the, had treasure hunt had not come to its, logical end there. But it was something which I think he really wrestled with, and he wanted to try to keep people safe from that point on, and give hints that would keep them from getting into too much danger, but also not compromise the hunt. And that worked to some extent. He did release some additional information. But the reality is, people were going to keep putting themselves into dangerous situations and saying, this is why. I know where the treasure is. I'm going to go find it. And this is why that doesn't apply to me. There's a certain exceptionalism to this. And I don't think Fenn ever anticipated any of that, but that's kind of where it goes when you do something like this.
So, we live in a time where people who are interested in a thing can find one another incredibly easily and clump together really, really easily. And traditionally, treasure hunters, I think, haven't really been interested necessarily in that communitarian process, because the more people who know about something, even going back to our friend Captain William Phipps, he went back for a second time, but there'd been so much publicity and everything. Went back to the same wreck, but there's basically nothing there at that point. Everybody's diving down there and getting stuff. You don't want a lot of people getting interested in this, but that's what happened here. There came to be, Dan, it seems, a community whose excitement about this and whose willingness even to sort of pool information cut across the grain of the typical solitary treasure hunter, Indiana Jones, trying to warn anybody else off what he's doing.
Yeah, well, thank the same thing we can thank or blame for everything else, and now the internet. It's the internet changed everything when it came to treasure hunting in the early 2000s. With hunts like The Secret and another one. Oh God, I'm not remembering it right now, but the forum was called 12. 12 jewels hidden, caches all over. Anyway, a couple other treasure hunts, and they became real internet phenomena in the early 2000s. And it turned out that people wanted to just talk about the treasure and chit chat over it because, nobody's more right than anybody else or nobody's more wrong than anybody else. So everybody can kind of be on equal footing in these situations and can debate these things and go back over it. And that's, can be why they get contentious at times, oh, you don't know anything, I know everything, vice versa. But, they can also be a lot of fun. And areas where people can really bond over the like-minded sensibility and have people not look at them crazy when they tell them, oh yes, I'm a treasure hunter. Oh, you're with people who understand that, and they get what that means to you and why that's special. And so the internet really very much took several other of these earlier hunts and then Fenn's hunt to another level, and the community that developed around it was fascinating. And really existed all year round. People who were boots on the ground, could do that from, if you live in New Mexico or Colorado, you might go out on frequent searches. If you don't live there, let's say if you're on the East Coast or in another country, it's a real hardship for you to get out there and actually search. And so, that could have deterred a lot of people in the past, but a lot of people then just kind of lived in the forums on this thing on the internet and might make a trip a year and might honestly not even make a trip at all, but still feel connected to this search. And, whole personalities develop, celebrities inside this thing develop. There becomes this whole YouTube community, the FenTuber community, who has all these shows, discussing various aspects of the treasure hunt. There's things that are being sold around it. The whole ecosystem develops around it, which is just fascinating. That's I think part of what took this hunt to the heights it did, was just that community developed and the ability to be involved in it at all times, even when you're not just out there for your brief 3 or 5 days of searching, per year or whatever. It's a nonstop part of your life, and there's constant developments in it. And Fenn himself, fostered a lot of that, and he loved to chit chat and talk and give interviews and, put out additional information that may or may not have been useful. And that, stoked his hunter's interest and kind of kept the thing going and really, feeling like it was in high gear at all times.
Yeah, and I really recommend reading Dan's book to sort of meet some of these really interesting personalities who become kind of...
So do I, for the record.
Yes, I'm sure you do recommend reading the book. Once again, Chasing the Thrill, Obsession, Death, and Glory in America's Most Extraordinary Treasure Hunt. One of my favorite little details is one of the people who turns up in this milieu is John Wayne Bobbitt, somebody who really already knew what it was like to lose a treasure, but for some reason or other becomes very interested in this thing. So we're almost out of time because I want to leave some time for our geocaching guest. But I mean, we might as well say that in 2020, 2 things happened. One of them was that Forrest Fenn finally really did die, but not before somebody found the treasure and even managed to get to his side and show it to him.
Yeah, kind of incredibly, there was actually a conclusion to this treasure hunt, which is something that, when I started the book, I had no idea was going to possibly be the case. And then, it actually, somebody found it, which is like totally crazy and amazing. And, when I was writing the book, I was like, at first, I was like, oh no, I was like finishing the book at the time. And I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna have to rip up half this thing. But ultimately, it ended up being actually a great thing for me because when first the guy found it in June of 2020, we didn't really know much of anything, and Fenn wasn't releasing details. He wasn't releasing where the thing was found or who found it. And I understood that because, the identity, if the finder's identity was revealed, that could really put that person in danger. There's a lot of people who don't like, that somebody found it or think that person, cheated them or whatever it is. And so the finder wanted to remain anonymous. And eventually, Fenn and the finder jointly released that the treasure had been found in Wyoming, but they still didn't release who it was. And then Fenn dies in September of 2020. And it could have been that, we didn't know anything else from there. And we might never have known, anything more. That was really what I thought was going to happen at the time. And then the finder published an anonymous essay on the website Medium, kind of detailing a few things about the search and explaining a little bit about himself. And, I was actually able to use that to get in touch with him. And then a few months later to actually, reveal to the world who he was in an article in Outside Magazine in December of 2020. And it turned out it was this guy, Jack Stoof, who was at the time a 32-year-old medical student out of Michigan, or raised in Michigan. And, it became kind of a different phenomenon from there. When people knew that, okay, Jack was a guy, Jack was real, and Jack had the treasure. And, that he's the guy. And, that led a lot of other people to have a lot of other questions because Jack did not tell them where he found it because he's trying to preserve the sanctity of that spot because, he doesn't want it to be the tourist attraction it would almost certainly become and pilgrimage site, if and when people knew where exactly Fenn had hidden the treasure. It was, I think, very gratifying for a lot of people to find out that there was this real person who actually found the treasure and have some conclusion to the story. But, unfortunately for others, there, are still so many unanswered questions, and things that they still want to know and want to know every detail that there's a lot of hunters who are still, involved in this to this day and are still trying to actually divine the location where Jack found the treasure. Even now.
All right. So instead of Indiana Jones and his bullwhip, it was a guy with a stethoscope. We're going to have to stop there.
I haven't heard that yet.
Feel free to use it. Dan Barbarisi, author of Chasing the Thrill, Obsession, Death, and Glory in America's Most Extraordinary Treasure Hunt. We will take a break. We'll come back with the story of geocaching.
Try to find it. Oh yeah. Forrest Fenn. Oh yeah. Forrest Fenn. Hiding the treasure. People try to find it. Where could it be? Nobody knows.
All right. So today's show, first of all, the technical producer, as usual, is Kat Pastor. She's in the studio and making everything happen the way it needs to happen. The producer of this episode is celebrity producer Lily Tyson. And so thanks very much to both of them. So, in 2009, right before I started doing this show in 2009, I was in Japan. And I met a woman named Karen, who was a teacher, but had two passions that seemed to be kind of connected. One of them was a group called the Hangover Hash House Harriers, sometimes described as a drinking club with a running problem. But these are people who do run these complicated, eccentric races, kind of, but they also drink a lot. And the other thing she was in love with was geocaching, and I'd never heard of geocaching. I didn't understand what it was. And once I understood what it was, I still wasn't quite sure why anybody did it. But fortunately, we have with us, it is a kind of treasure hunting, though. It's a little bit divorced from the implied monetary rewards of treasure hunting, but it's a treasure hunt nonetheless. Here to tell us more about it is Marcellus Cad, who writes the blog Geocaching While Black. First of all, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much.
So for those who are completely uninitiated and in the dark, explain what geocaching is.
Geocaching is basically a GPS-assisted treasure hunt. It's like a scavenger hunt. People hide things in various places. They publish the coordinates for them, and people go out and go to these places and find them. Sometimes they are, simple and easy to find. Sometimes they are incredibly difficult to get to. Sometimes they are cleverly camouflaged, so they're hard to get to find. Sometimes they're cleverly constructed, so you have to basically solve puzzles to even get into the box. But each and every one of them is its own little treasure.
I like the way you describe it on your blog, that you say that you use multi-million-dollar satellites to find pieces of Tupperware. And so that brings up the question. So, yeah, when you open the box, and I think there's usually like a log or a journal or something that you can sign into, indicating that you did solve this problem, and there you are. Can you explain to me what would be the appeal of doing this?
For me, it started out really simply. It started out as a way to just sort of fill time, something new that I hadn't done before. After a while, once it really grabbed me, I realized that there was something really enriching about basically pitting my Mark I brain and my Mark I eyeball against the environment. Trying to find this little thing, whether it is in a forest or whether it is in the middle of the city. Eventually, I started to venture out further because, I'm not exactly I've never been an outdoors person, but I started going further afield, and I started enjoying getting out into nature and finding these things. And then basically one day I looked up and realized I'd been doing this for hundreds of days in a row, and I was hooked.
And never getting stumped, really, or at least putting together this incredible Cal Ripken-like string of finding something every single day. How long did the streak go?
Oh, it's yesterday was 1,144 days in a row.
Right. So
and here's the crazy part. Yeah. I'm not even close to having the largest streak in the state.
So we should say something about that, too, which is just as we were saying with Dan. There's this geocaching is also this incredible community. There are conferences and meetings and all kinds of ways, I guess, for all of you people to stay in touch. There's something that I never heard of until by the way, your blog is very addictive. I wanted reading way more entries than I had planned to. It's something called Mingo Madness, which I don't entirely understand. But so that's a whole other thing, right? It's a solitary activity, and then you get together with people.
Yes. One of the specific types of caches is an event cache where people actually gather together to talk and to meet and to get together and go find other caches. And then, of course, there are larger versions of that, mega events, which are more like regional events, and even giga events, which are huge international conferences, basically.
So we should say a little bit about the title of the blog. Geocaching, I think, is for the most part understood to be a somewhat benign, and maybe compared to treasure hunting, out in the wilds where you can get washed away in a river, a somewhat safe thing to do. Although I would like to say, though, when I was getting to know my friend Karen in Japan, there's a lot of places in Japan, like in cities, where you take 2 steps off the sidewalk past the fence and like a monkey bites you right away. So, but, or a wild boar charges at you or something. But for you, yeah, we've learned, if we didn't know already over the last 2 or 3 years, we've learned that being black in America and walking around someplace where people don't know you and don't understand what you might be doing there is not necessarily the same as being white and doing those same things.
Not at all. Geocaching itself is completely race neutral. But I also realize I'm doing this race neutral thing in a world that isn't entirely race neutral. It's, just the way it is. And so I started the reason why I even started, writing about this and why I call it Geocaching All Black is because early on I had been reading a forum and somebody posed the question of how many times various cachers had gotten stopped by the cops while they were doing their thing. And a lot of people were saying, I've been, stopped once in 5 years, or I've never been stopped in 4 years, or stuff like that. And at the time I realized I'd been doing it for 6 months, and I'd been stopped by cops like 7 times. And that wasn't even counting security guards and other random people who just wanted to know what I was doing in the area.
So there's so much I want to ask you, and time is short. I think I don't want to run out of time without you at least mentioning one place, one thing you would have seen, one experience that you had that was really remarkable to you that just no way would you have ever been there without your geocaching habit.
Man, there's a lot. I mean, I never would have gone to all 254 counties in Texas without this. One of the ones that really sticks out to me is, you mentioned Mingo Madness, and the reason why it's called that is because the oldest geocache that's still active is in a little town in Kansas called Mingo, and it's almost 21 years old now, and it's been in the same place. But a couple of counties over from there is it's off this side road near St. Francis, Kansas. You go about 11 miles north, heading for the Nebraska border, and there is a place called the Arickaree Breaks.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I pulled over the side of the road, and there was this ancient ammo can that was almost as old as Mingo. And I just stopped and I looked, because there is this giant, it's basically this area in between, large hills, but they're like these little canyon-like carvings out of the rock, and they just look almost like impossible gouges out of the earth that shouldn't be there, and yet they are, and they're just so absolutely gorgeous and stunning. And after I found the thing, I literally just stood there for about 5 minutes.
Wasn't that the place where the elk hunters came up to you and asked you explained geocaching to them, and they explained elk hunting to you?
Exactly. And one of those elk hunters was also from Texas, and he had never been there. And so this, probably 20-year-old kid just stood there and looked at it just like I had been looking at it 5 minutes before they showed up.
Yeah, I loved that entry.
Amazing.
I love that entry in your blog. So you only have like 20 seconds to answer this question, but there's just like this other thing that you do that I think is unconnected to geocaching. You have this obsession with taking pictures of courthouses. Can you explain that in 20 seconds?
Oh, sure. A long time ago, I thought it would be interesting to visit every courthouse in Texas. And since I decided to find a cache in every county in Texas, I figured, why not? I'd go ahead and go to the courthouse while I was there. And once I was done with Texas and I started going to other states, I figured, I've been doing this for 254 counties. I might as well keep going. And now I'm at 565 and still going.
Right. You are the only person ever to visit Roswell, New Mexico and be more excited about the courthouse than about the dead aliens. I don't know whether that's an accomplishment or something that you should seek treatment for, but one way or another, it marks you up. The blog is called Geocaching While Black. It is a really terrific account of Americana just because all the places he goes. Well, I mean, you just have to read it. Marcellus Cat, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for listening. We're all done.
So take warning here and heed to shun bad company, or you'll wind up just like me as I sail. My name is Captain Kidd as I sailed, oh my name is Captain Kidd as I sailed. My name is Captain Kidd and God's laws I did forbid. And most wickedly I did as I sailed. Most wickedly I did as I sailed.